I never thought I'd hear my mother's voice again. Not after 6 years of silence. Not after everything they did. But there it was, soft, familiar, and completely detached from reality. "Rebecca, sweetheart. It's so good to hear your voice." For a moment, I just stood there, my phone pressed against my ear, my heart hammering. I was in my office, overlooking the Chicago skyline, my coffee growing cold on my desk. A normal day. And then this. I almost hung up. I should have hung up. Instead, I took a slow breath. "Mom." She let out a shaky sigh, like she was relieved I hadn't immediately told her to go to hell. "I've been following your career," she said. "Your work is incredible. We're so proud of you." I laughed. I couldn't help it. A sharp, humorless sound. Proud. My voice came out colder than I expected. "That's funny, considering you threw me out like I was nothing." A pause. Then quieter. "I know." She hesitated. "I need to explain. But first, we need your help, Rebecca." Of course. Of course. This wasn't about me. It was never about me. I should have hung up then. I should have blocked her number, deleted the call, and gone back to my life. But instead, against my better judgment, I found myself asking, help with what? And that's when she told me. Samantha, my younger sister, the golden child, the reason I had been kicked out, was in trouble. Again. For kids. No stable job. A mess of failed relationships. And now, pregnant again. My parents, who had spent years cleaning up after her, were drowning under the weight of it all. My father, once so proud and composed, was delaying retirement indefinitely. They had remortgaged their house. "We can't do this alone anymore," my mother admitted, voice trembling. "And you," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "You're the successful one, Rebecca. We were hoping you could step in." I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. The rage came first. Hot and sharp, burning through my chest. Then, beneath that, something colder. Something closer to grief. They hadn't called me when I was sleeping in my car. When I was working 2 jobs just to survive. When I had nothing. But now? Now that Samantha's life was falling apart, they suddenly remembered I existed. I exhaled slowly. When I spoke, my voice was steady. "No." Silence. Then, "Rebecca, please. She's your sister." I clenched my jaw. "And I was your daughter." But that didn't seem to matter when you kicked me out to make room for her. I could hear my mother breathing on the other end of the line. "I understand why you're upset," she finally said, her voice tight. "But family takes care of each other." I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? Where was my family when I needed them?" No answer. I ended the call. That should have been the end of it. But the next night, I got an email. At first, I thought it was spam. But then I saw the subject line. "Please, just look." It was from my mother. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was filled with photos of Samantha's kids. Jacob, 6 years old, standing outside of school, his backpack hanging off one shoulder. Ava, 4, holding a stuffed rabbit with a wary look on her tiny face. Lucas, 2, sitting on the floor in a diaper, his hands covered in marker. And then, at the bottom, the final line of the email. "She's pregnant again. The father is gone. The kids need someone stable in their lives. Please, Rebecca." I shut my laptop so fast it nearly knocked over my coffee. No. I wasn't doing this. I wasn't letting them drag me back into their mess. I had built a life for myself. I had a fiancé, a career, a home that no one could take away from me. I wasn't throwing all of that away to fix a family that had already proven I wasn't worth saving. But then 2 days later, my mother called again. This time, she was crying. "It's Samantha," she choked out. "She was in a car accident." "It's bad, Rebecca." "The baby," she let out a shaky breath. "They had to do an emergency C-section. The baby's in the NICU." My stomach dropped. "She's in surgery," my mother whispered. "We don't know if she's going to make it." I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers ached. This wasn't my problem. This wasn't my problem. And yet, an hour later, I was in my car, driving back to the place I had sworn I would never return to. The drive felt both too long and too short. Chicago disappeared behind me, the city lights fading into empty highways and open stretches of nothing. My hands were tied on the wheel, my thoughts a tangled mess. I shouldn't be doing this. I owed them nothing. But the words kept repeating in my head, over and over. "We don't know if she's going to make it." By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, my stomach was in knots. I wasn't ready for this. But I got out of the car anyway. Inside, the waiting room was dimly lit. full of the kind of muffled conversations and sterile air that made hospitals feel like they existed outside of time. And then I saw them. My mother sat hunched in one of the chairs, arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. My father was beside her, his face buried in his hands. For a moment, I just stood there. I could turn around, walk away. They wouldn't stop me. But then my mother lifted her head. Her eyes widened. "Rebecca." I didn't move. She stood slowly, like she wasn't sure I was real. "You came." I swallowed. "How is she?" My father looked up at the sound of my voice. His face was pale, lined in a way I didn't remember. He blinked like he was seeing a ghost. "She's out of surgery," he said. His voice was rough. "Tired. The doctors say she'll pull through, but she lost a lot of blood." I nodded, my throat tight. "The baby?" My mother let out a shaky breath. "She's stable. For now." I exhaled, some of the pressure in my chest easing. At least they were both alive. A long silence stretched between us. My mother's gaze searched mine, desperate, like she wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe beg me to stay. I looked away. "I need some air." I turned before they could stop me, walking briskly toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool against my burning skin. I leaned against the wall, staring up at the sky, trying to clear my head. Then my phone buzzed. "Daniel." I answered immediately. "Hey," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "Hey," he echoed. "Did you make it there okay?" "Yeah." A pause. Then, softer. "How are you feeling?" I let out a bitter laugh. Like I stepped into a time machine. Everything feels exactly the same. I could picture him frowning. "You don't have to stay, Rebecca." I closed my eyes. I know. But I also knew I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Daniel didn't push. He just sighed. "I'll be here when you get back, okay?" That, more than anything, steadied me. "I know," I murmured. We hung up, and I stood there for a moment longer, gathering myself. Then, reluctantly, I turned back inside. My parents were still in the waiting room. They both looked up as I approached, as if afraid I would disappear if they blinked. "I want to see her," I said. My mother's breath hitched. "Of course." She led me down the hallway. The walls were lined with muted paintings, the kind meant to be comforting but just felt empty. Then, finally, we stopped outside a door. My mother hesitated. "She doesn't know you're here." I didn't respond. Just pushed the door open. Samantha looked small. She was pale against the hospital sheets, her hair a tangled mess around her face. Her arm was wrapped in four, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. I hadn't seen her in 6 years. And yet, looking at her now, it still hurt. I took a step inside. Then another. Samantha stirred, blinking slowly. Her gaze was unfocused at first, hazy from painkillers. Then her eyes landed on me. She froze. "Rebecca." Her voice was hoarse. "Fragile." I swallowed. "Yeah." Something flickered across her face, shock, disbelief, maybe even something close to relief. "You're here," she murmured. I didn't know how to respond to that. She let out a breathy, disbelieving laugh. I thought I was hallucinating. A silence stretched between us. Then, in a small voice, she asked, "The baby?" "She's alive," I said. "Still in the NICU, but stable." Samantha's whole body sagged in relief. Tears filled her eyes, and she turned her face toward the window, like she didn't want me to see. "I was so scared," she admitted. I stayed quiet. "I don't even remember the crash," she continued. "Just 1 minute I was driving, and the next, I woke up here." Her fingers trembled against the sheets. She swallowed hard. Her voice broke. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "I keep thinking, what if I didn't make it? What would have happened to them? To Jacob, Ava, Lucas?" I exhaled slowly. I wasn't ready for this conversation. But she wasn't done. "I screwed up," she whispered. "I know I did. I kept making mistakes, and Mom and Dad they always bailed me out. And I let them." She swallowed. "But this was different." I saw it on their faces. They didn't know what to do anymore. And for the first time, I realized I don't either. I clenched my jaw. "Samantha." "I never wanted to be the failure," she said, her voice raw. "I never wanted to be the reason you—" She cut herself off, blinking rapidly. I stared at her. 6 years. 6 years of anger, of resentment, of convincing myself she would never change. And now, for the first time, she looked lost, just like I had been. I let out a slow breath. "Then fix it," I said quietly. She looked at me, wide-eyed. "You say you don't know what to do?" I leaned forward. "Then figure it out. Get help. Be better." Because those kids, they deserve better than this. Her lips parted, like she wanted to argue. But then, slowly, she nodded. I know, she whispered. I know. I studied her for a long moment. And for the first time in years, I believed her. I didn't leave. I told myself I would. That I'd check on Samantha, see for myself that she was alive, and then drive back to Chicago without looking back. But then I met the kids. It happened the next morning. My mother had been hovering, watching me like she was afraid I'd disappear if she blinked. Finally, she said, hesitant, they'd like to meet you. I froze. I wasn't ready for that. But before I could come up with an excuse, my father spoke. Jacob's been asking about you, he said quietly. He's seen pictures. Something in my chest tightened. I had spent years convincing myself that I was nothing to this family, that I had been erased. And yet, somewhere out there, my nephew knew who I was. I swallowed hard. Okay. The drive back to my parents' house was suffocating. Every street, every turn, every stupid landmark brought back memories I had buried deep. When we pulled up, I hesitated. The last time I stood in front of this house, I had been kicked out. Now, I was walking back in. The front door opened before I could knock. Jacob stood there, staring up at me. He was smaller than I expected, 6 years old, all skinny limbs and big brown eyes. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then, finally, he whispered, "Your Aunt Rebecca." I felt something crack in my chest. I crouched down. "Yeah," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "That's me." Jacob shifted on his feet. "Mom showed me pictures," he said. "She said you build big buildings." I swallowed against the sudden lump in my throat. Before I could respond, a little girl peeked out from behind him. Ava, 4 years old, tiny, with Samantha's eyes. She studied me for a long moment, then tilted her head. "You look like Mommy." I didn't know what to do with that. "Can I hug you?" Jacob asked suddenly. I blinked. "You," my voice caught. "Yeah, buddy. You can." And then he threw his arms around me. I wasn't ready for it. I barely had time to brace myself before he latched on like he had known me forever. I squeezed my eyes shut, my arms wrapping around him on instinct. Ava hesitated, then slowly crept closer, pressing her tiny body against my side. I held them both. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. When they finally pulled back, Jacob looked up at me, his expression serious. "Is Mommy gonna be okay?" I let out a shaky breath. "She's strong," I said. "She'll be okay." Jacob nodded like he wanted to believe me. Ava tugged at my sleeve. "Are you gonna stay?" I hesitated. And then, against all logic, against everything I had told myself before walking through that door, I nodded. For a little while. That night, I went to my old room. I hadn't set foot in it since the night I was forced to leave. The moment I stepped inside, I stopped short. It was exactly the same. My desk. My old books. The walls still covered in sketches and blueprints I had drawn as a teenager. They never gave my room to Samantha. I stood there, my pulse pounding, staring at the life I had been ripped away from. And then I saw the letters. They were stuffed in a drawer, beneath some old notebooks. Letters addressed to me. Some were years old, the ink smudged, the pages worn. My father's handwriting. I sank onto the bed, my hand shaking as I unfolded the first one. "Rebecca, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I think about you every day. I hope you're okay. I hope you know Aya." The words stopped abruptly. I flipped to another letter. "We were wrong. I see that now. I see it every time I look at Samantha and wonder why we didn't see the signs sooner. We failed you. We failed both of you." I swallowed hard. The next letter was from 2 years ago. "I saw an article about you today. Rebecca Callahan, lead architect on a sustainable project in Chicago. Your mother cried. She won't admit it, but she misses you more than anything." My fingers tightened around the paper. I had spent so long hating them, hating what they did to me. And now, reading this, I didn't know what to feel. Regret? Sadness? None of it changed the past. None of it gave me back the years I had lost. But it made one thing clear: they had never stopped thinking about me. I wasn't ready to forgive them. Maybe I never would be. But for the first time, I wondered if I could at least try to understand them. The next morning, I went back to the hospital. I wasn't planning to stay long. I just wanted to check on Samantha, make sure she was stable, and maybe, see the baby. Then I'd figure out my next move. But when I got there, my mother was already waiting for me in the hallway. "She's awake," she said softly. Something in my stomach twisted. I wasn't ready for this conversation. Still, I followed her into the room. Samantha looked small. I remembered her as the loud, reckless, untouchable girl who could get away with anything. But now, lying there, pale and bruised, she looked fragile. Her arm was wrapped in four, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. She turned her head toward the door, and the second she saw me, she froze. "Rebecca." Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." She swallowed hard. Something flickered across her face, relief, maybe, or disbelief. "You're here," she murmured. I didn't respond. Samantha let out a shaky breath. I thought I was dreaming. A long silence stretched between us. Then, in a small voice, she asked, "The baby?" "She's alive," I said. "Still in the NICU, but stable." Her entire body sagged in relief. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned her head away, staring at the ceiling. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I don't even remember the crash. One minute, I was driving, and the next, I woke up here." I swallowed, shifting on my feet. I didn't know how to comfort her. She let out a humorless laugh. "God, I keep thinking, what if I didn't make it? What would have happened to them? To Jacob, Ava, Lucas?" I didn't answer. Because she was right. What would have happened to them? Would my parents have managed? Would the kids have ended up bouncing between homes, caught in the fallout of Samantha's mess? And worse, would I have even known? She exhaled, rubbing at her face. "I screwed up, didn't I?" Her voice was raw, heavy with something I hadn't heard from her before. Guilt. I studied her, unsure how to respond. For so long, I had wanted this moment. I had wanted her to realize what she had done, to admit that her choices had consequences. And now that it was happening, it didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. Samantha swallowed hard. "I never wanted to be the one who always messed up." She let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. "You always had your shit together. You were always the smart one, the one who knew exactly what she wanted." And her voice faltered. "I hated that. I hated that no matter what I did, I couldn't be like you." I flinched. I had spent my whole life thinking she was the one they wanted. Samantha let out a shaky breath. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but," she hesitated. "Will you stay? At least for a little while?" I clenched my jaw. And then, before I could stop myself, I nodded. She closed her eyes. "Okay." I turned to leave, but then I hesitated. "Samantha," I said quietly. She blinked up at me. I saw the letters. Her brow furrowed. "What letters?" I exhaled slowly. "Dad wrote to me. He never sent them, but I found them in my old room." Something shifted in her expression, something complicated. "I didn't know that," she murmured. I nodded. Then, softer, "He regrets it. So does Mom." Samantha let out a breath. "Do you?" I hesitated. Then, finally, I said, "I don't know." She didn't push. And for the first time in years, neither of us felt like we had to. I didn't leave. Not yet. I told myself it was temporary. Just a few more days. But every time I thought about walking away, something held me back. Maybe it was Jacob's hopeful eyes. Maybe it was the way Ava quietly curled into my side whenever I sat down. Maybe it was the tiny, fragile baby in the NICU, fighting for her life. Or maybe, deep down, I just wasn't ready to close this chapter. Not yet. Samantha was discharged 2 days later. She was still weak, moving carefully, wincing with every step, but she was alive. She barely spoke on the way home, staring out the car window, fingers curled loosely in her lap. The house was quieter than I remembered. The kids rushed to her the moment she stepped inside. Jacob clung to her, his little arms wrapping tight around her waist. Ava hid behind him, watching, unsure. Lucas, still too young to fully understand, just looked up at her, blinking. Samantha knelt carefully, pulling them close. "I missed you," Jacob whispered. She shut her eyes, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "I missed you too, buddy." I watched from the doorway, something twisting in my chest. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old notebook I had left behind when I was kicked out. The pages were filled with sketches, rough blueprints, half-formed ideas, pieces of a life I had been forced to rebuild from scratch. Samantha sat down across from me. She hesitated, tracing an invisible pattern on the table before speaking. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to fix everything I've screwed up." I sighed, closing the notebook. "Then don't try to fix everything at once. Just start." She swallowed hard. "How?" I studied her for a long moment. And then I told her. Therapy. Stability. A real plan for the kids. No more bouncing from one crisis to another. No more waiting for someone else to clean up her messes. She nodded, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I want to be better," she said. "I really do." For the first time in years, I believed her. A week later, I packed my bags. I had done what I came here to do. Samantha was trying. My parents, though still imperfect, were trying too. The kids were safe. The baby was growing stronger. It was time for me to go home. Before I left, Jacob ran up to me, shoving a piece of folded paper into my hand. "I made you something," he said. I unfolded it. A drawing. Me, standing in front of a tall building. A messy, uneven attempt at replicating something he must have seen in one of my articles. Something inside me cracked. "You're gonna be back, right?" he asked. His voice was small. Hopeful. I crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I will," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. As I walked out the door, my mother called my name. I turned. She hesitated, then stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. Not yet. But I hugged her back. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. I didn't cry, but I didn't feel empty either. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally closed a door on my own terms.